Well, I've had an interest in family history for as long as I can remember, really, because my grandma used to tell me loads of stories, and I think they'd been passed down to her by her father. But there was a certain gap in the story, especially to do with her father's father, which I've always wanted to solve, that mystery. My grandma had this really lovely old photo. It's called an ambrotype, and it's like a glass negative. And it's kind of deteriorating now, the eyes are disappearing and it's cracked, but it's actually her grandmother. And she had an illegitimate child in 1863. And that child was my nana's father. So he must have kept that photo all through his childhood, because his mother died before he knew her. Wondered what happened to her, who the father of the child was, and it's just this idea, there's a whole part of my history that I can't know, because we can't find anything in the records. I really like to go to the places where she lived and find all the details I can. Just hope that one day something might pop up, or someone might have a letter in a drawer that might tell me who the father of this child was. I think in a way it's because I think it must have been so important to my great-grandfather himself, because he talked to my grandmother about it so much. It's almost like he so wanted to know who his father was. He told his own daughter. She talked to me about it, and I kind of feel like it's my job, if I can, to try and find it out for him in a way, which might sound a bit weird. But, you know, I'd just love to know. And also for me, because I'm interested in family history anyway, to know where I come from, because there's a whole line of the family. It just stops with this illegitimacy. You hit a brick wall, and you think there could be people walking around Derby or anywhere else that my cousins that I don't know about, because we're related, and I just want to know who my family are, really.
He was illegitimate, and I've been trying to find his parents for years, but we never have. I was told that his mother was made pregnant with this young man of a very rich family. The family wouldn't let the young man marry her, so he was sent away to Scotland. And she was in service with his family, obviously. The baby came along and they wouldn't have anything to do with it. So the baby was taken away by my grandfather's grandmother and an aunt, and he was brought up with them. So we've been trying ever since to try and find out who the father was, but we never have. I mean, he had 14 children himself eventually. And he used to say, you should all been riding around in your own carriage and pair if it have found out who the parents were.
We're here at Duffield Church, which is where my great-grandfather would have grown up, brought up by his grandmother. But the family had been here since the 1500s. There's generations and generations of them in this churchyard here, but there's only one gravestone with the Morton name on. So you think, gosh, I mean, I'm assuming because they couldn't afford those, a lot of people couldn't at that time. There are gravestones that have been engraved by some of my ancestors because they were stonemasons, but that and the one grave with the Morton name on are the only actual remnants we have here. I think there were many sort of poorer people in past centuries who just, you know, it was only people who had a little bit more money that had a gravestone. That's Elijah Morton, who I believe was a farmer in Duffield, and he was the brother of Nathan, who engraved the stone we looked at over there. And Nathan was the father of Sarah, who had the illegitimate child. It fascinates me to think at this place, you know, at this church, there's been burials, christenings, marriages over 400 years, all happening here in my family. I like to come here and think my family are here. They're all under the ground somewhere. Like Sarah, who had the illegitimate child, but, you know, we don't know where. So again, it's like the missing pieces and that hidden history. My great-grandfather, in the 1881 census, he appears in one of these cottages as a newlywed. He was 17 and his wife was 18 when they got married. One of the family anecdotes is that they had to elope to get married because their families didn't want them to marry. Actually, if you look at the dates of the births of the children, it looks as if they had to get married, which is quite ironic, really, considering, you know, his own ancestry. Obviously, he did marry his wife to avoid there being another illegitimacy, and I like to think that it was a love match. They went on to have another 16 children, in fact, believe it or not, but only 15 survived, which was quite a lot for those days. This is Macclesfield Street. From his birth certificate, this is where my great-grandfather was actually born, but being because his mother was from Duffield, we're assuming she must have been sent away. It was often very hushed up when women got pregnant at those times. On Thomas Williams' birth certificate, it says he was born at 35 Macklin Street, Derby. We don't know who was living there. The only way we would know that is if he'd been born in the same year as the census, which was every 10 years. But if you look at the census for 2 years before, it may be someone completely different living there. It was quite a long way from Duffield to Derby in those days with transport as it was, so we're thinking that she must have been sent away to try and keep it hidden as much as possible. Number 35, I was told that the number sequences had changed, but looking at this, which is Victoria Terrace, I know it was there at that time, so it's possible in this part of the street the numbers haven't changed, so this could be the very house where he was born. But apparently my grandmother, who was his daughter, the daughters were always brought up very strictly. The idea of having another illegitimate child in the family was obviously something they were really strict about, and they really kept their daughters sort of very carefully monitored, which I know was partly what it was like in that day anyway, but I think it was really drilled into them, be careful and watch the boys and all that kind of thing. But looking back through the family history, you can possibly see why. Not only was he born that way, but he nearly had the same thing. His own wife had to get married.
Didn't talk about his illegitimacy, because in those days it was rather a stigma. It's only little bits and things that we found out later, in later years.
Do you think maybe your aunts knew more than they were letting on?
They probably did. But they didn't talk about it much. Especially to like young children as we were then. They wouldn't talk to us about it. Not like today. It's all out in the open, isn't it, with everybody? But in those days it was quite a stigma.
In the 1860s, it would have been a massive scandal. Girls were often thrown out of their homes, ostracised. It would have seemed like the worst thing in the world when she had the baby at that time. There was a huge sense of shame attached to it. And I guess Thomas William, my great-grandfather, must have felt that as growing up, she was illegitimate. Obviously, it's totally different now. My own grandmother told me a story. She was growing up just before the First World War. They knew a local girl who got pregnant, and her own father pushed her off the back of a horse and cart to try and get her to miscarry. It's just, that was the attitude towards it then. And you think, well, also I kind of feel, I don't know, imagining what it must have felt like for Sarah, the mother at that time, how that would have felt. You think it seems so unfair, and that kind of, I feel quite impassioned about that as well. Especially because the father didn't have anything to do with the child. Although he's my blood ancestor, he had no role in bringing up his son. But I just like to know who he was and why he didn't stick around.
My father, he was very strict, having 4 daughters, I think he was more lenient with me being the youngest one of the family. My sisters used to say I used to get away with murder compared to them, because he was that sort of man that if, like he used to say, if you got into trouble, he would have disowned us. He really would. Because he was so strict in his morals. He was very moralistic.
Subsequent generations wouldn't have talked about it. He was told a very romantic story that his father was coming back to marry his mother, and then she died, and his family wouldn't let him marry her because she was a servant in their family. Whether he was told that just to console him for not knowing his father, or whether it was true, there was a tragic love story there. But she died a year after he was born anyway, so he could never ask his own mother. And presumably his grandmother just kind of, apart from telling him that nice romantic story, I think it was all kept very hushed up, really. So, and even now, we've got a relative who's 96. She's the oldest living relative at the moment, and you can see that as soon as you mention it, people just don't want to talk about it. It's even now, I think that in the older generations, that sense of shame is still there.
When I got married, walking up the church, he said to me, "Well, my duck," because he was a Yorkshireman, my father. He says, "Well, my duck," he says, "I don't care what happens to me now, I'm seeing my youngest get married honourably."
I think my grandmother was quite open in talking about it, maybe because she discussed it a lot with her dad. He'd passed the photo on to her of his mother. Maybe she kind of took hold of his passion for trying to find out who his mother, who his father was. It was before the First World War. That was her grandma. Well, I think she looked quite like her dad. And he was supposed to look like Sarah, and yes, I think you can see the resemblance between those two, really, can't you?
She's got dark eyes, and my mum had got dark brown
quite
eyes.
Similar, really. It really makes me think that she was the one who told me all of these stories when I was a child. Really gripped me, all these things that she had taken on that her father had told her. And obviously, there was the hidden side of his history. He didn't know who his father was. He talked to her about that, and she'd pass that on to me. you know, and I'm still looking now, you know, and I find that really, you know, I sometimes come back here and think, gosh, they're both there now. If only they could tell me more, you know. We're now in Bolton St Mary's Churchyard, where Thomas William was buried. He died in 1919, and he's buried with his wife Sarah Ellen was buried after him. And then my grandmother eventually was buried with both of her parents, so they're all lying here under a tree, which I think is nice. Nice shady spot for them, so I like to come here and bring flowers every now and again. Quite recently I actually was given access to the death certificate for Thomas William Morton, and it seems that he died in the asylum, which I'd known nothing about, had never ever been mentioned in the family, presumably was again a hidden thing that was kept hushed up. What it was, apparently he had an accident when he was riding his bike and he banged his head on a manhole cover. That's just one of the family stories, that he was down the manhole and someone put the cover down too hard. It just shows how these stories are become embroidered over time, but either way he banged his head and eventually got a brain tumour, so I can only assume, I know that can affect your behaviour. In those days they didn't give them medical care, they just put them in the asylum, which would be the Old Pastures Hospital as far as I know, most of which has been knocked down now, but we've kind of completed his story. You know, he had a bit of a sad beginning and end to his life, but I like to think the bit in the middle was happy. You know, he married and had 15 children, you know, worked at the Derby Loco as it was on the railways, you know, had a productive, happy life. But as I say, the end was quite sad, rather like the beginning really.